Hello everyone. This morning I'm going to be reading from the first part of Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung. This is called The Importance of Dreams. Man uses the spoken or written word to express the meaning of what he wants to convey. His language is full of symbols, but he also often employs signs or images that are not strictly descriptive. Some are mere abbreviations or strings of initials, such as UN, UNICEF, or UNESCO. Others are familiar trademarks, the names of patent medicines, badges, or insignia. Although these are meaningless in themselves, they have acquired a recognizable meaning through common usage or deliberate intent. Such things are not symbols, they are signs, and they do no more than denote the objects to which they are attached. What we call a symbol is a term, a name, or even a picture that may be familiar in daily life, yet that possesses specific connotations in addition to its conventional and obvious meaning. It implies something vague, unknown, or hidden from us. Many Cretan monuments, for instance, are marked with the design of the double adze. This is an object that we know, but we know not its symbolic implications. For another example, take the case of the Indian who, after a visit to England, told his friends at home that the English worship animals, because he found eagles, lions, and oxen in old churches. He was not aware, nor are many Christians, that these animals are symbols of the evangelists and are derived from the vision of Ezekiel, and that this in turn has an analogy to the Egyptian sun god Horus and his 4 sons. There are, moreover, such objects as the wheel and the cross that are known all over the world, yet that have symbolic significance under certain conditions. Precisely what they symbolize is still a matter for controversial speculation. Thus, a word or an image is symbolic when it implies something more than its obvious and immediate meaning. It has a wider unconscious aspect that is never precisely defined nor fully explained. Nor can one hope to define or explain it. As the mind explores the symbol, it is led to ideas that lie behind the grasp of reason. The wheel may lead our thoughts towards the concept of a divine son, but at this point, reason must admit its incompetence. Man is unable to divine a divine being. When with all our intellectual limitations we call something divine, we have merely given it a name, which may be based on a creed, but never on factual evidence. Because there are innumerable things beyond the range of human understanding, we constantly use symbolic terms to represent concepts that we cannot define or fully comprehend. This is one reason why all religions employ symbolic language or images, but this unconscious use of symbols is only one aspect of the psychological fact of great importance. Man also produces symbols unconsciously and spontaneously in the form of dreams. It is not easy to grasp this point, but the point must be grasped if we are to know more about the ways in which the human mind works. Man, as we may realize, if we reflect for a moment, never perceives anything fully or comprehends anything completely. He can see, hear, touch, and taste, but how far he sees, how well he hears, what his touch tells him, and what he tastes depend on the number and quality of his senses. These limit his perception of the world around him. By using scientific instruments, he can partly compensate for the deficiencies of his senses. For example, he can extend the range of his vision by binoculars or of his hearing by electrical amplification, but the most elaborate apparatus cannot do more than bring distant or small objects within range of his eyes, or make faint sounds more audible. No matter what instruments he uses, at some point he reaches the edge of certainty beyond which conscious knowledge cannot pass. There are, moreover, unconscious aspects of our perception of reality. The first is the fact that even when our senses react to real phenomena, sights and sounds, they are somehow translated from the realm of reality into that of the mind. Within the mind they become psychic events whose ultimate nature is unknowable, for the psyche cannot know its own psychical substance. Thus every experience contains an indefinite number of unknown factors, not to speak of the fact that every concrete object is always unknown in certain respects, because we cannot know the ultimate nature of matter itself. Then there are certain events of which we have not consciously taken note. They have remained, so to speak, below the threshold of consciousness. They have happened, but they have been absorbed subliminally, without our conscious knowledge. We can become aware of such happenings only in a moment of intuition or by a process of profound thought that leads to a later realization that they must have happened. And though we may have originally ignored their emotional and vital importance, it later wells up from the unconscious as a sort of afterthought. It may appear, for instance, in the form of a dream. As a general rule, the unconscious aspect of any event is revealed to us in dreams, where it appears not as rational thought, but as a symbolic image. As a matter of history, it was the study of dreams that first enabled psychologists to investigate the unconscious aspect of conscious psychic events. It is on such evidence that psychologists assume the existence of an unconscious psyche, though many scientists and philosophers deny its existence. They argue naively that such an assumption implies the existence of two subjects, or, to put it in common phrase, two personalities within the same individual. But this is exactly what it does imply, quite correctly, and it is one of the curses of modern man that many people suffer from, this divided personality. It is by no means a pathological symptom. It is a normal fact that can be observed at any time and everywhere. It is not merely the neurotic whose right hand does not know what the left hand is doing. This predicament is a symptom of a general unconscious that is undeniable common inheritance of all mankind. Man has developed consciousness solely and laboriously in a process that took untold ages to reach the civilized state, which is arbitrarily dated from the invention of script in about 4000 BC, and this evolution is far from complete, for large areas of the human mind are still shrouded in darkness. What we call the psyche is by no means identical with our consciousness and its contents. Whoever denies the existence of the unconscious is in fact assuming that our present knowledge of the psyche is total, and this belief is clearly just as false as the assumption that we know all there is to be known about the natural universe. Our psyche is part of nature, and its enigma is as limitless. Thus we cannot define either of the psyche or nature. We can merely state that we believe them to be and describe what we believe them to be and describe as best we can how they function, quite apart therefore from the evidence that medical research has accumulated. There are strong grounds of logic for rejecting statements like, there is no unconscious. Those who say such things merely express an age-old Mysonianism, a fear of the new and unknown. There are historical reasons for this resistance to the idea of an unknown part of the human psyche. Consciousness is a very recent acquisition of nature, and it is still in an experimental state. It is frail, menaced by specific dangers, and easily injured. As anthropologists have noted, one of the most common mental derangements that occur among primitive people is what they call the loss of a soul, which means, as the name indicates, a noticeable disruption, or more technically, a disassociation of consciousness. Among such people whose consciousness is at a different level of development from ours, the soul, or psyche, is not felt to be a unit. Many primitives assume that man has a bush soul as well as his own, and that this bush soul is incarnate in a wild animal or a tree, which with the human individual has some kind of psychic identity. This is what the distinguished French ethnologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl called a mystical participation. He later retracted this term under pressure of adverse criticism, but I believe that his critics were wrong. It is well-known psychological fact that an individual may have such an unconscious identity with some other person or object. Pause for break of coffee. This identity takes a variety of forms among primitives. If the bush soul is that of an animal, the animal itself is considered as some sort of brother to the man. A man whose brother is a crocodile, for instance, is supposed to be safe when swimming a crocodile-infested river. If the bush soul is a tree, the tree is presumed to have something like parental authority over the individual concerned. In both cases, an injury to the bush soul is interpreted as an injury to the man. In some tribes, It is assumed that a man has a number of souls. This belief expresses the feeling of some primitive individuals that they each consist of several linked but distinct units. This means that the individual psyche is far from being safely synthesized. On the contrary, it threatens to fragment only too easily under the onslaught of unchecked emotions. While this situation is familiar to us from the studies of anthropologists, it is not so irrelevant to our own advanced civilization as it might seem. We too can become disassociated and lose our identity. We can be possessed and altered by moods, or become unreasonable and unable to recall important facts about ourselves or others, so that people ask, "What the devil has got into you?" We talk about being able to control ourselves, but self-control is a rare and remarkable virtue. We may think that we may have ourselves under control, yet a friend can easily tell us things about ourselves of which we have no knowledge. Beyond doubt, even in what we call a high level of civilization, human consciousness has not yet achieved a reasonable degree of continuity. It is still vulnerable and liable to fragmentation. This capacity to isolate part of one's mind, indeed, is a valuable characteristic. It enables us to concentrate upon one thing at a time, excluding everything else that may claim our attention. But there is a world of difference between a conscious decision to split off and temporarily suppress part of one's psyche and a condition in which this happens spontaneously, without one's knowledge or consent, and even against one's intention. The former is a civilized achievement, the latter is primitive loss of soul, or even the pathological cause of a neurosis. Thus, even in our day, the unity of consciousness is still a doubtful affair. It can too easily be disrupted. An ability to control one's emotion that may be very desirable from one point of view would be a questionable accomplishment from another, for it would deprive social intercourse of variety, color, and warmth. It is against this background that we must review the importance of dreams, those flimsy, evasive, unreliable, vague, and uncertain fantasies. To explain my point of view, I would like to describe how it developed over a period of years, and how I was led to conclude that dreams are the most frequent and universally accessible source for the investigation of man's symbolizing faculty. Sigmund Freud was a pioneer who first tried to explore empirically the unconscious background of consciousness. He worked on the general assumption that dreams are not a matter of chance, but are associated with conscious thoughts and problems. This assumption was not in the least bit arbitrary. It was based upon the conclusion of eminent neurologists, for instance, Pierre Janet, that neurotic symptoms are related to some conscious experience. They appear to be split off areas of the conscious mind, which at other times and under different conditions can be conscious. Before the beginning of this century, Freud and Joseph Breuer had recognized that neurotic symptoms, hysteria, certain types of pain, and abnormal behavior are in fact symbolically meaningful. They are one way in which the unconscious mind expresses itself, just as it may in dreams, and they are equally symbolic. A patient, for instance, who is confronted with an intolerable situation may develop a spasm whenever he tries to swallow. He can't swallow it. Under similar conditions of psychological stress, another patient has an attack of asthma. He can't breathe the atmosphere at home. A third suffers from a peculiar paralysis of the legs. He can't walk, i.e., he can't go on anymore. A fourth, who vomits when he eats, cannot digest some unpleasant fact. I could cite many examples of this kind, but such physical reactions are only one form in which the problems that trouble us unconsciously may express themselves. They more often find expression in our dreams. Coffee break 2. Any psychologist who has listened to numbers of people describing their dreams knows that dream symbols have much greater variety than the physical symptoms of neurosis. They often consist of elaborate and picturesque fantasies. But if the analyst who is confronted by this dream material uses Freud's original technique of free association, he finds that dreams can eventually be reduced to certain basic patterns. This technique played an important part in the development of psychoanalysis, for it enabled Freud to use dreams as the starting point from which the unconscious problem of the patient might be explored. Freud made the simple but penetrating observation that if a dreamer is encouraged to go on talking about his dream images and the thoughts that they prompt in his mind, he will give himself away and reveal the unconscious background of his ailments, in both what he says and what he deliberately omits saying. His idea may seem irrational and irrelevant, but after time it becomes relatively easy to see what it is that he is trying to avoid, what unpleasant thought or experience he is suppressing. No matter how he tries to camouflage it, everything he says points to the core of his predicament. A doctor sees so many things from the seamy side of life that he is seldom far from the truth when he interprets the hints that his patient produces as signs of uneasy conscience. What he eventually discovers, unfortunately, confirms his expectations. Thus far, nobody can say against Freud's theory of repression and wish fulfillment as apparent cause of dream symbolism. Freud attached particular importance to dreams as the point of departure for a process of free association, but after a time I began to feel that this was misleading and an inadequate use of the rich fantasies that the unconscious produces in sleep. My doubts really began when a colleague told me of an experience he had during the course of a long train journey in Russia. Though he did not know the language and could not even decipher the Cyrillic script, he found himself musing over the strange letters in which the railway notices were written. He fell into a reverie in which he imagined all sorts of meanings for them. One idea led to another. In his relaxed mood, he found that this free association had stirred up many old memories. Among them, he was annoyed to find some long-buried, disagreeable topics, things he wished to forget and had forgotten consciously. He had, in fact, arrived at what psychologists would call his complexes, that is, repressed emotional themes that can cause constant psychological disturbances, or even, in many cases, the symptoms of neurosis. This episode opened my eyes to the fact that it was not necessary to use a dream as the point of departure for the process of free association. If one wished to discover the complexes of a patient, it showed me that one can reach the center directly from any point of the compass. One could begin from Cyrillic letters, from meditations upon a crystal ball, a prayer wheel, or a modern painting, or even from casual conversation about some trivial event. The dream was no more and no less useful in this respect, than any other possible starting point. Nevertheless, dreams have a particular significance, even though they often rise from an emotional upset in which the habitual complexes are also involved. The habitual complexes are the tender spots of the psyche which react most quickly to an external stimulus or disturbance. That is why free association can lead one from any dream to a critical secret thoughts. At this point, however, it occurred to me that if I was right so far, it might reasonably follow that dreams have some special and more significant function of their own. Very often dreams have a definite, evidently purposeful structure indicating an underlying idea or intention, though, as a rule, the latter is not immediately comprehensible. I therefore began to consider whether one should pay more attention to the actual form and content of a dream, rather than allowing free association to lead one off through a train to ideas to complexes that could as easily be reached by other means. This new thought was a turning point in the development of my psychology. It meant that I gradually gave up following associations that led far away from the text of a dream. I chose to concentrate rather on the associations to the dream itself, believing that the latter expressed something specific to the unconscious was trying to say. The change in my attitude towards dreams involved a change of method. The new technique was one that could take account of all the various wider aspects of a dream. A story told by the unconscious mind has a beginning, a development, and an end. But the same is not true of a dream. Its dimensions in time and space are quite different. To understand it, you must examine it from every aspect, just as you may take an unknown object in your hands and turn it over and over until you are familiar with every detail of its shape. Perhaps I have now said enough to show how I came increasingly to disagree with free association as Freud first employed it. I wanted to keep as close as possible to the dream itself and to exclude all of the irrelevant ideas and associations that it might evoke. True, these could lead one towards the complexes of a patient, but I had a more far-reaching purpose in mind than the discovery of complexes that might cause neurotic disturbances. There are many other means by which these can be identified. The psychologist, for instance, can get all the hints he needs by using word association tests, by asking the patient what he associates to a given set of words, and by studying his responses. But to know and understand the psychic life process of an individual whose personality, it is important to realize that his dreams and their symbolic images have a much more important role to play. Almost everyone knows, for example, that there is an enormous variety of images by which the sexual act can be symbolized, or one might say represented in the form of an allegory. Each of these images can lead, by a process of association, to the idea of sexual intercourse and to the specific complexes that any individual may have known his own sexual attitudes. But one could just as well unearth such complexes by daydreaming on a set of indecipherable Russian letters. I was thus led to the assumption that a dream can contain some message other than the sexual allegory, and that it does so for definite reasons. To illustrate this point, a man may dream of inserting a key in a lock, of wielding a heavy stick, or of breaking down a door with a battering ram. Each of these can be regarded as a sexual allegory, but the fact that his unconscious, for its own purposes, has chosen one of these specific images, it may be the key, the stick, or the battering ram, is also of major significance. The real task is to understand why the key has been preferred to the stick, or the stick to the ram, and sometimes this might even lead one to discover that it is not the sexual act at all that is represented, but some quite different psychological point. From this line of reasoning, I concluded that not only the material that is clearly and visibly part of a dream should be used in interpreting it, the dream has its own limitation. Its specific form itself tells us what belongs to it and what leads away from it. While free association lures one away from that material in a kind of zigzag line, the method I involved is more like a circumambulation whose center is the dream picture. I work all around the dream picture and disregard every attempt that the dreamer makes to break away from it. Time and time again in my professional work, I have had to repeat the words, "Let's get back to your dream. What does that dream say?" For instance, a patient of mine dreamed of a drunken and disheveled vulgar woman. In the dream it seemed that this woman was his wife, though in real life his wife was totally different. On the surface, therefore, the dream was shockingly untrue, and the patient immediately rejected it as dream nonsense. If I, as his doctor, had let him start a process of association, he would inevitably have tried to get as far away as possible from the unpleasant suggestion of his dream. In that case, he would have ended with one of his staple complexes, a complex possibly that had nothing to do with his wife, and he would have learned nothing about the special meaning of this particular dream. What then was his unconscious trying to convey by such an obviously untrue statement? Clearly, it somehow expressed the idea of a degenerate female who was closely connected with the dreamer's life. But since the projection of this image onto his wife was unjustified and factually untrue, I had to look elsewhere before I found out what this repulsive image represented. In the Middle Ages, long before psychologists demonstrated that by reason of our glandular structure there are both male and female elements in all of us, it was said that every man carries a woman within himself. It is this female element in every male that I have called the anima. This feminine aspect is essentially a certain inferior kind of relatedness to the surroundings and particularly to women, which is kept carefully concealed from others as well as from oneself. In other words, though an individual's personality may seem quite normal, he may be concealing from others or even from himself the deplorable condition of the woman within. That was the case with this particular patient. His female side was not nice. His dream was actually saying to him, "You are in some respects behaving like a degenerate female," and thus gave him an appropriate shock. An example of this kind, of course, must not be taken as evidence that the unconscious is concerned with moral injunctions. The dream was not telling the patient to behave better, but was simply trying to balance the lopsided nature of his conscious mind, which was maintaining the fiction that he was a perfect gentleman throughout. It is easy to understand why dreamers tend to ignore and even deny the message of their dreams. Consciousness naturally resists anything unconscious and unknown. I have already pointed out the existence among primitive peoples of what anthropologists call Mysonism, a deep and superstitious fear of novelty. The primitives manifest all the reactions of wild animals against untoward events, but civilized man reacts to new ideas in much the same way, erecting psychological barriers to protect himself from the shock of facing something new. This can easily be observed in any individual's reaction to his own dreams when obliged to admit a surprising thought. Many pioneers in philosophy, science, and even literature have been victims of the innate conservatism of their contemporaries. Psychology is one of the youngest of the sciences, because it attempts to deal with the workings of the unconscious. It has inevitably encountered Mysonism in an extreme form. More coffee. Okay, part 2. Past and Future in the Unconscious. So far, I've been sketching some of the principles on which I approach the problem of dreams. For when we went to investigate man's faculty to produce symbols, dreams proved to be most basic and accessible material for this purpose. The two fundamental points in dealing with dreams are these. First, the dream should be treated as a fact, about which one must make no previous assumptions except that it somehow makes sense. And second, for the dream is a specific expression of the unconscious. One could scarcely put the principles more modestly. No matter how low anyone's opinion of the unconscious may be, he must concede that it is worth investigating. The unconscious is at least on a level with a louse, which, after all, enjoys the honest interest of the entomologist. If somebody with little experience and knowledge of dreams thinks the dreams are just chaotic occurrences without meaning, he is at liberty to do so. But if one assumes that they are normal events, which as a matter of fact they are, one is bound to consider that they are either casual, i.e. that there is a rational cause for their existence, or in a certain way purposive, or both. Let us now look at a little more closely at the ways in which the conscious and unconscious contents of the mind are linked together. Take an example with which everyone is familiar. Suddenly you find you can't remember what you were going to say next, though a moment ago the thought was perfectly clear. Or perhaps you were about to introduce a friend, and his name escapes you as you were about to utter it. You say you can't remember. In fact, though, the thought has become unconscious, or at least momentarily separated from consciousness. We find the same phenomenon with our senses. If we listen to our continuous note on the fringe of inaudibility, the sound seems to stop at regular intervals and then starts again. Such oscillations are due to periodic decrease and increase in one's attention, not to any change in the note. But when something slips out of our consciousness, it does not cease to exist, any more than a car that has disappeared around a corner has vanished into thin air. It is simply out of sight. Just as we may later see the car again, so we may come across those thoughts that were temporarily lost to us. Thus, part of the unconscious consists of a multitude of temporarily obscured thoughts, impressions, and images that, in spite of being lost, continue to influence our conscious minds. A man who is distracted or absent-minded will walk across the room to fetch something. He stops seemingly perplexed. He has forgotten what he was after. His hand gropes about among the objects on the table as if he were sleepwalking. If he is oblivious of his original purpose, yet he is unconsciously guided by it. Then he realizes what it is that he wants. His unconscious has prompted him. If you observe the behavior of a neurotic person, you can see him doing many things that he appears to be doing consciously and purposefully. Yet if you ask him about them, you will discover that he is either unconscious of them or has something quite different in mind. He hears and does not hear. He sees yet is blind. He knows and is ignorant. Such examples are so common that the specialist soon realizes that unconscious contents of the mind behave as if they were conscious, and that you can never be sure in such cases whether thought, speech, or action is conscious or not. Had to turn my light on for a second. It is this kind of behavior that makes so many physicians dismiss statements by hysterical patients as utter lies. Such persons certainly produce more untruths than most of us, but lie is scarcely the right word to use. In fact, their mental state causes an uncertainty of behavior because their consciousness is liable to unpredictably eclipse by an interference from the unconscious. Even their skin sensations may reveal similar fluctuations of awareness. At one moment, the hysterical person may feel a needle prick in the arm. At the next, it may pass unnoticed. If his attention can be focused on a certain point, the whole of his body can be completely anesthetized, that's a hard word to say, until the tension that causes this blackout of the senses has been relaxed. Sense perception is then immediately restored. All the time, however, he has been unconsciously aware of what was happening. Gotta get a drink. The physician can see this process quite clearly when he hypnotizes such a patient. It is easy to demonstrate that the patient has been aware of every detail. The prick in the arm or the remark made during an eclipse of consciousness can be recalled as accurately as if there had been no anesthesia or forgetfulness. I recall a woman who was once admitted to the clinic in a state of complete stupor. When she recovered consciousness the next day, she knew who she was but did not know where she was, how or why she had come there, or even the date. Yet after I had hypnotized her, she told me why she had fallen ill, how she had gotten to the clinic, and who admitted her. All these details could be verified. She was even able to tell the time at which she had been admitted, because she had seen a clock in the entrance hall. Under hypnosis, her memory was as clear as if she had been completely conscious all the time. When we discuss such matters, we usually have to draw on evidence supplied by clinical observation. For this reason, many critics assume that the unconscious in all its subtle manifestations belongs solely to the sphere of psychopathology. They consider an expression of the unconscious as something neurotic or psychotic, which has nothing to do with normal mental state. But neurotic phenomena are by no means the products exclusively of disease. They are in fact no more than pathological exaggerations of normal occurrences. It is only because they are exaggerations that they are more obvious than their normal counterparts. Hysterical symptoms can be observed in all normal persons, but they are so slight that they usually pass unnoticed. Forgetting, for instance, is a normal process in which certain conscious ideas lose their specific energy because one's attention has been deflected. When interest turns elsewhere, it leaves in shadow the things which one was previously concerned. Just as a searchlight lights upon a new area by leaving another in darkness. This is unavoidable, for consciousness can keep only a few images in full clarity at one time, and even this clarity fluctuates. But the forgotten ideas have not ceased to exist. Although they cannot be reproduced at will, they are present in a subliminal state, just beyond the threshold of recall, from which they can rise again spontaneously at any time, often after many years of apparent total oblivion. I am speaking here of things we have consciously seen or heard and subsequently forgotten. But we all see, hear, smell, and taste many things without noticing them at a time, either because our attention is deflected or because the stimulus to our senses is too slight to leave a conscious impression. The unconscious, however, has taken note of them, and such subliminal sense perceptions play a significant part in our everyday lives. Without our realizing it, they influence the way in which we react to both events and people. An example of this that I found particularly revealing was provided by a professor who had been walking in the country with one of his pupils. Absorbed in serious conversation, suddenly he noticed that his thoughts were being interrupted by an unexpected flow of memories from his early childhood. He could not account for this distraction. Nothing in what he had said seemed to have any connection with these memories. On looking back, he saw that he had been walking past the farm when the first of these childhood recollections had surged up in his mind. He suggested to his pupil that they should walk back to the point where the fantasies had begun. Once there, he noticed the smell of geese, and instantly he realized that it was this smell that had touched off the flow of memories. And that's something. In his youth, he had lived on a farm where geese were kept, and their characteristic smell had left a lasting, though forgotten impression. As he passed the farm on his walk, he noticed the smell subliminally, and this unconscious perception had called back long-forgotten experiences of his childhood. This perception was subliminal because the attention was engaged elsewhere, and the stimulus was not strong enough to deflect it and to reach consciousness directly, yet it had brought up these forgotten memories. Such a cue or trigger effect can explain the onset of neurotic symptoms, as well as more benign memories when a sight, smell, or sound recalls a circumstance in the past. A girl, for instance, may be busy in her office, apparently in good health and spirits. A moment later, she develops a blinding headache and shows other signs of distress. Without consciously noting it, she has heard the foghorn of a distant ship, and this has unconsciously reminded her of an unhappy parting with a lover whom she has been doing her best to forget. Aside from the normal forgetting, Freud has described several cases that involve forgetting of disagreeable memories that one is only too ready to lose. As Nietzsche remarked, where pride is insistent enough, memory prefers to give away. Thus, among the lost memories, we encounter not a few that owe their subliminal state and their incapacity to be voluntarily reproduced to their disagreeable and incompatible nature. The psychologist calls these repressed contents. A case in point might be that of a secretary who is jealous of one of her employer's associates. She habitually forgets to invite this person to meetings, though the name is clearly marked on the list that she is using. But if challenged on the point, she simply says she forgot, or was interrupted. She never admits, not even to herself, the real reason for her omission. Many people mistakenly overestimate the role of willpower and think that nothing can happen to their minds that they do not decide or intend, but one must learn to discriminate carefully between intentional and unintentional contents of the mind. The former are derived from the ego personality. The latter, however, arise from a sort that is not identical with the ego, but is its other side. It is this other side that would have the secretary forget invitations. There are many reasons why we forget things that we have noticed or experienced, and there are just as many ways in which they may be recalled to the mind. An interesting example is that of cryptomnesia, a concealed recollection. An author may be writing steadily to a preconceived plan, working out an argument or developing the line of a story, when he suddenly runs off at a tangent. Perhaps a fresh idea has occurred to him, or a different image, or a whole new subplot. If you ask him what prompted that digression, he will not be able to tell you. He may not even have noticed the change, though he has now produced material that is entirely fresh and apparently unknown to him before. Yet it can sometimes be shown convincingly that what he has written bears a striking similarity to the work of other authors, a work that he believes he has never seen. I myself found a fascinating example of this in Nietzsche's book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where the author reproduces almost word for word an incident reported in a ship's log for the year of 1686. By sheer chance, I had read this seaman's yarn in a book published about 1835, half a century before Nietzsche wrote, and when I found the similar passage in Thus Spake Zarathustra, I was struck by its peculiar style, which was different from Nietzsche's usual language. I was convinced that Nietzsche He must have seen the old book, though he made no reference to it. I wrote to his sister, who was still alive, and she confirmed that she and her brother had in fact read the book together when he was 11 years old. I think, from the context, it is inconceivable that Nietzsche had any idea that he was plagiarizing the story. I believe that 50 years later it had unexpectedly slipped into focus in his conscious mind. In this type of case there is genuine, if unrealized, recollection. Much the same sort of thing may happen to a musician who has heard a peasant tune or popular song in childhood and finds it's cropping up as the theme of a symphonic movement that he is composing in adult life. An idea or an image has moved back from the unconscious into the conscious mind. What I have so far said about the unconscious is no more than a cursory sketch of the nature and functioning of this complex part of the human psyche. But it should have indicated the kind of subliminal material for which the symbols of our dreams may be spontaneously produced. This subliminal material can consist of all urges, impulses, and intentions, all perceptions and intuitions, all rational or irrational thoughts, conclusions, inductions, deductions, and premises, and all variety of feeling. Any or all of these can take the form of partial, temporary, or constant unconsciousness. Such material has mostly become unconscious because, in a manner of speaking, there is no room for it in the conscious mind. Some of one's thoughts lose their emotional energy and become subliminal. That is to say, they no longer receive so much of our conscious attention, because they have come to seem uninteresting or irrelevant, or because there is some reason why we wish to push them out of sight. It is, in fact, normal and necessary for us to forget in this fashion, in order to make room in our conscious minds for new impressions and ideas. If this did not happen, everything we experience would remain above the threshold of consciousness, and our minds would become impossibly cluttered. This phenomenon is so widely recognized today that most people who know anything about psychology take it for granted. But just as conscious contents can vanish into the unconscious, new contents which have never been conscious can arise from it. One may have an inkling, for instance, that something is on the point of breaking into consciousness, that something is in the air, or that one smells a rat. The discovery that the unconscious is no mere depository of the past, but is also full of germs of future psychic situations and ideas, led me to my own new approach to psychology. A great deal of controversial discussion has arisen around this point, but it is a fact that, in addition to memories from a long-distant conscious past, completely new thoughts and creative ideas can also present themselves from the unconscious. Thoughts and ideas have never been conscious before. They grow up from the dark depths of the mind like a lotus and form a most important part of the subliminal psyche. We find this in everyday life, where dilemmas are sometimes solved by the most surprising new propositions. Many artists, philosophers, and even scientists owe some of their best ideas to inspirations that appear suddenly from the unconscious. The ability to reach a rich vein of such material and to translate it effectively into philosophy, literature, music, or scientific discovery is one of the hallmarks of what is commonly called genius. We can find clear proof of this fact in the history of science itself. For example, the French mathematician Poincare, I don't know how to say that, and the chemist Kekule owed important scientific discoveries, as they themselves admit, to sudden pictorial revelations from the unconscious. The so-called mystical experience of the French philosopher Descartes involved a similar sudden revelation in which he saw in a flash the order of all sciences. The British author Robert Louis Stevenson had spent years looking for a story that would fit his strong sense of man's double being, when the plot of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was suddenly revealed to him in a dream. And I can add something to this just from my own reading of famous artists. My favorite artist, Francis Bacon, said that he used to see images in series in his mind over and over and over again of paintings he'd like to create, and most of the paintings that he made were trying to trap these images, and he said he never could get the images exactly as he saw them. Later I shall describe in more detail how such material arises from the unconscious, and I shall examine the form in which it is expressed. At the moment, I simply want to point out that the capacity of the human psyche to produce such new material is particularly significant when one is dealing with the dream symbolism, for I have found again and again in my professional work that the images and ideas that dreams contain cannot possibly be explained solely in terms of memory. They express new thoughts that have never yet reached the threshold of consciousness. There is not enough time left in this sketching session to go over the next section in this book, The Function of Dreams. So I'm going to leave you with a time lapse of the rest of this drawing and a little bit of music. And my next drawing session, I will read a few more sections from Man and His Symbols. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope that perhaps what you've learned from this passage might give you a little bit of insight into your own psyche. Thank you. Have a great day. Okay, you can go now. Seriously, you can go. Yeah. See you next time. Take care.